Hello listeners, welcome to an interview episode. My guest today is Professor Aidan Dodson. Professor Dodson is the Honorary Professor of Egyptology at the University of Bristol in England. He earned his PhD from the University of Cambridge and has authored many books on a variety of subjects, from ancient Egypt to World War I battleships and English royal burials. You probably know Professor Dodson best as the co-author of The Complete Royal Families of Ancient Egypt with Diane Hilton and The Mummy in Ancient Egypt with Salima Ikram. He is also the author of The Royal Tombs of Ancient Egypt from Pen and Sword Publishing and 2 volumes titled Amarna Sunset and Amarna Sunrise, a history of the Amarna period from the reign of Amenhotep III to the aftermath of Akhenaten. I've been using these books extensively as I researched the past 30 or so episodes. As you can imagine, this is an excellent opportunity to learn more about the later years of Akhenaten and his successors. So sit back, relax, and I hope you enjoy the discussion. One more thing. This episode was organized by Pen and Sword Publishing, who provided me with a free e-copy of Professor Dodson's book, The Royal Tombs of Ancient Egypt. If you are interested in purchasing a copy of The Royal Tombs, there is a link in the episode description. I am not receiving any commission, payment, or promotion from sales of this book, and in this interview, Professor Dodson and I will be discussing many topics from his accomplished career. My special thanks to Emily of Pen and Sword for reaching out to organize the conversation, and to Professor Dodson for agreeing to sit down with me halfway across the world. First things first, Professor Dodson, thank you very much. Welcome to the History of Egypt podcast.
Nice to be here.
So you published a book through Pen and Sword Publishing called The Royal Tombs of Ancient Egypt. And your research previously in your career has covered many aspects of history, particularly funerary customs and practices in different cultures, not just Egypt. My question is, what first drew you to these facets of the human experience?
I suppose originally it was morbid curiosity as an 8-year-old, because that's when I first got interested in archaeology and then more broadly Egyptology and so on. Yeah, I think there was just this little kid's sort of interest in looking at books with skeletons in them and stuff like that, and looking at real skeletons in museums. And that just really then became sort of the core of a lot of what I've done. You know, my PhD was on the containers for mummified intestines. So yeah, I think that's where it all comes from. But I think if you want to rationalise why I'm still interested in all this kind of stuff, is that the cliche that sort of death comes to all of us, and therefore it's something everybody has to engage with. And it's fascinating to see the similarities and differences there are between the ways that completely separate cultures address the same kind of question. You know, what sort of shape of container do you put the body in? What sort of memorial, if any, do you have for the interface between this world and the next? All those kinds of things. And so the different ways in which different people sort of come up with that kind of thing is probably what underpins my continuing interest in funerary archaeology.
Great. So in the sense of the cultural context then, so you've worked across Bronze Age remains, but also far more recent, particularly with the Royal Tombs of Britain, which you've published on. In your work across different cultural contexts, what are some of the sort of the standout similarities that you've noticed in how humans of different cultures treat their dead?
I think one thing is the way that not everybody, but a lot of them seem to come up with the idea of putting the body in something which looks like the body. Now, you've got the classic Egyptian mummy cases, but then in medieval Europe, you find various things which, if you didn't know they were medieval European, you'd probably think they were Egyptian mummy cases. They're made of lead rather than wood or cartonnage. and then the giveaway that some of them then have sort of Christian crosses and things on them. But basically, the idea of having an outer envelope which looks like what's inside it, or what was inside it originally looked like, seems to be something which is quite a powerful pull, and can be derived by cultures which have got absolutely nothing in common as far as sort of the underlying conceptions are concerned. You've got things which are quite clearly like the Christian context, and in fact, the whole thing goes completely against the ashes to ashes, dust to dust kind of idea. Once you start the whole idea, which also you find in Islam as well, where you're not supposed to have any kind of funerary monument, yet people do. You have the various mausolea of medieval Cairo and so on, all of which are actually not supposed to be allowed at all. However, they do it. So there's another sort of desire here to actually leave something on earth whereby people will recognise who you were, and by conspicuous consumption, how wealthy you were, and all those kinds of things. So those are some of the kind of things which keep on popping up, even if they totally contradict what the religious mores underpinning that particular culture actually are.
Interesting. Moving now to Egypt specifically, your 2009 and 2014 publications, Amarna Sunset and then Amarna Sunrise, made for a sort of, I guess, a reverse duology. You studied the era's later years before going back to the earlier. Looking back, did many of the views you presented in Sunset undergo significant evolution or reevaluation between the two books?
Not particularly, no, because really the Sunset was written basically because I was nagged into it, because my interest for a long time had been to do with how the Amarna period ended. I had certainly my ideas about the earlier part, but Sunset was written initially as a one-off about the late 18th dynasty, and then I got nagged by certain dear colleagues that I'd started a story halfway through. Could I still tell the first part as well? So actually, what I ended up writing was something that was already in my head, and it would have probably been written the same way had I written it the right way round. It was just like at that time I hadn't really thought about writing a book on the early part of Amarna. It was just stuff I'd got on my head, and I think the only things which really sort of changed was the DNA stuff came out in between the two books. Therefore, Sunrise ended up addressing that. And then when I did the second edition of Sunset, I was able to incorporate all the implications of that then. That's really the sort of connection, I suppose, by doing it that way around. Yeah, no, because about 75% of the book was changed between the two editions. Or 75% of the pages had some kind of changes. Some of them were just sort of corrections and a few bits. Some were complete rewrites. And what it really does indicate is how fast-moving the world of Egyptology actually is. You can write a book in 2009, and 10 years later, the second edition is almost unrecognisable. The same is also to some degree true with my third intermediate period book, Afterglow of Empire, because the second edition of that has very, very significant changes as compared with the previous one, which had only been done, 6-7 years previously. So it's one of those things when I talk to my students, I really do say to them, you've got to be really careful of reading anything more than about 10 years old, because just one new discovery can change history quite literally. Between the two editions of Sunset, the discovery of the year 16 graffito was showing Nefertiti is still King's great wife in that year, which contradicts people who thought she was dead by then, and my view that she'd transitioned to becoming female pharaoh significantly earlier than that. So that one discovery has ripples, which means you have to change all kinds of things. And that's true. So very much that's one of the real things I try and underline to people with Egyptian history is that Egyptian history is very much a working hypothesis on the day you happen to write that bit. The very next day, just one potsherd or bit of graffito can suddenly pull that whole thing apart because it's ultimately a house of cards. And if it turned out, some of those cards have been in place for decades, and then just suddenly one of the very fundamental ones at the bottom, with the whole Nefertiti business, the question of when did she disappear, suddenly the whole thing, and you've got to start rebuilding the whole thing from scratch.
And the general rule is that new potsherd always shows up the day after your publisher sends it off for print.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. The number of I'm always sort of playing catch up during when I'm correcting proofs, but it's sod's law. Yes, but it's the day after it goes to press, and you can't do anything else. Suddenly, something comes up. I'm very lucky with AUC Press in that when they go to reprint, they are perfectly happy for me to, if necessary, completely rewrite the book. There are some publishers I've worked with who basically say, we're going to reprint it, you're allowed to correct any errors, otherwise it's going as is. Whereas one of the things I like about AUC Press is they're very open. They want the books to be as good as they possibly can be. So what is initially, hey, we want to do a paperback version of this. Have you got any corrections? Then turns into a complete rewrite. But that, which I think is important. There are far too many books out there which were great in their day, have been reprinted to death over the years without any kind of corrections or updates. And when you see something bright, even particularly when it's been reset, so it looks like a brand new book for 2020. It's only if you're an insider you realise actually it was written in 1950, and actually pretty well everything in there. It's not wrong necessarily, but the nuances have fundamentally changed, and the way we think about things have changed. On one occasion, one of my students didn't understand why I was berating him for having written an essay based on a book written in 1898. He said, well, surely it's all about the same, isn't it? No. And your mark and the mark I've given you should indicate to you not to do that again.
I'm sure that was a formative experience for him.
Indeed. I take the view as far as when I'm marking work, I'm harsh but fair.
Fair enough. I distinctly remember one of my colleagues at Auckland lamenting the fact that when teaching undergraduates, essays still cropped up referencing phrases, the golden bough, in terms of religious principles, how ironically, that book about resurrection just would not die.
Just so, I think I'm sort of an idea I'm currently running with is the idea of the zombie fact. That you have these things which were a perfectly good idea 90 years ago, yet they've now been disproved by academia, but they're out there already. It's almost like a virus which is out there and keeps on getting caught no matter how you try and suppress it. So these ideas about Akhenaten and Nefertiti having fallen out and all those sorts of things, which are all based on mistaking erased names of Kia for Nefertiti. They're still out there, and they're still taught in guide schools in Egypt. So if I'm at Amarna with some tour guides, they will give that whole spiel about the breakdown in the marriage of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. And there was a period when they would bring in sort of Princess Diana as a modern parallel. And it's that zombies are a dangerous thing in archaeology.
That was part 1 of my conversation with Professor Aidan Dodson. After the break, we dive deeper into some further aspects of the late Amarna period, including the various studies like the 2010 DNA study and how they reconstruct different aspects of this history. Also, we discuss royal tombs and the construction of these fascinating monuments. Finally, we touch on Professor Dodson's career and how he became interested in Egyptology. That is part 2 after the break. See you in a moment. moving now to the question of scientific material, if you would. So in Amarna Sunrise, you publish an appendix regarding the large-scale DNA study conducted on the mummies of this period. And for the benefit of the audience listening now, looking back, how did the Egyptological community, yourself and those colleagues you spoke to about it, how did the Egyptological community respond to those announcements at the time and subsequently?
I think the problem people had at the time, and I think as if people reflect on it more, was the unscientific way it was actually presented. What I mean by that is that some of the raw data was presented, but then that didn't follow the normal protocols, which is you then sort of list all the possible options, then you choose, then you sort of suggest which is probably your favourite one. Throughout, it was simply the preferred option of the team was what was stated as being the fact. It then required people to go away and take the raw data, find a tame DNA specialist, because I don't think I know any Egyptologist who really feels himself qualified to be able to delve into this properly, and see whether or not the raw data did other stuff, which the thing which interested me particularly was this whole question about the relationship between the younger lady in KV35, the KV55 mummy, and Tutankhamun. It was stated that the article stated that Tutankhamun was the offspring of brother-sister marriage, full stop. It didn't actually point out, it took Mark Gabold's finding a tame DNA person to start finding that actually the same genetic markers in Tutankhamun's mummy could be caused by 3 generations of first cousin marriages. That the very fact that was not actually pointed out in the original article is emblematic of the sort of problem with it. So that I think I wasn't alone in that. It was that because this is sort of the raw stuff is stuff which we as Egyptologists need guidance through. We want to know what are the full range of options. And then we can take a view, not be told this is our preferred option. Particularly when, certainly as far as the parentage of Tutankhamun was concerned, if it was a brother-sister marriage, suddenly you've got to find out where the hell is this sister of Akhenaten in the record, which there's absolutely no trace of one. Particularly at the point in the reign where Tutankhamun is likely to have been born, which is the point in the reign where we've got the largest amount of material. So it just seemed very, very unlikely you could possibly have had another queen floating around in there who is also king's sister. So, but then when, say, Mark managed to work out that actually a first cousin, 3 generations of first cousins, then you start being able to play more tunes. And as I've cut, my own conclusion was that Nefertiti is almost certainly Tutankhamun's mother. But that's kind of analysis of what you can do with the material isn't helped when somebody simply says, this is my preferred solution. Yeah, great. And I think I think that's the problem with the whole, all of that DNA, that there is this question about what are what options are there within the raw data, but also there is the further thing about, well, how is this real? There are still people out there who say this kind of DNA cannot be preserved in mummies, particularly mummies of that particular period. Because Joanne Fletcher, although she still hasn't got around to publishing any of this, says that her idea about the fact you've got these crystals of natron in the flesh indicates it had to have been a liquid natron bath, and it was a liquid natron bath. There is no way that DNA can be preserved. So what do we do there? And there's a poor Egyptologist who sort of only went as far as O level in chemistry and physics. What am I supposed to do? And I think most of us feel the same kind of way. Yeah, and the other issue is, of course, because this was all announced with great fanfare in the newspapers and so on as fact, when you actually say to somebody in the general public, actually, this may not actually be correct, they start sort of, how can you possibly sort of deny scientific fact and things like that? it is generating more zombies. Just I was talking about earlier on about zombie facts. This whole question, Tutankhamun was the offspring of a brother-sister marriage, is, although not necessarily wrong, there are, it's still not impossible that there could be a woman out there who might turn up, on a potsherd tomorrow. Certainly that it is a fact that he was an offspring of brother-sister marriage is a zombie fact.
It's the difference between an interpretation that is possible versus an interpretation that is likely.
Yeah, and also one which is a real fact. Occasionally there are things which are inescapable facts, but this isn't one of them. It's an opinion, and an opinion which happens to be one of a range of statistically equally possible opinions as well.
So bringing this to some of those potential facts is based on your years of research. What would you say maybe are some of the key takeaways, both positive and negative, from how that particular study was conducted and published and the results that it presented?
I think so. From the point of view of the study itself, the fact it was being done is important. But one thing about the study was that it was not done as one would normally do a DNA study with blind testing as well. Everybody sort of, as far as I understand it, everybody knew this was DNA from Tutankhamun or KB55 or whatever. So there was never this is just simply John Doe, which was really what should have been done. The trouble is the material couldn't be taken out of Egypt. There was only one lab, so therefore the way we normally do it of just feeding in this sample as an anonymous numbered thing into a lab without telling them what it was supposed to be didn't happen. So therefore there is a certain amount of expectation in the result, the raw result, which then feeds into sort of people's preferred solutions to who people are and how they relate to each other. So there's that whole thing. There's also, I think, the fact that there wasn't really sufficient statement of, hey, there are people who don't actually believe any of this is even possible. So there was a sort of the whole thing was, and the study and its publication was given a greater sort of gloss of, this is our facts we are now deriving from this genetic material, rather than some interesting data which we now have to sort of unpack and sort of talk about in more detail. And so that then feeds on into the way the whole thing is published. The fact it was interesting, it was published in a medical journal rather than an Egyptological journal, so it may well have met sort of scientific reviewing standards, but the fact that it didn't actually then provide the full range of possibilities is something which I'm sure would have been seized upon by a referee if it had gone through Journal of Egyptian Archaeology or one of the standard Egyptological journals. So there's
a good point.
There's and why not? Or why wasn't there a parallel version which was gone through all that? So there's the publication has issues, and I say the results. Now people are beginning to be able to get them independently unpacked to some degree. It provides some very interesting food for thought about sort of how people might be related to each other. But the whole thing is slightly undermined by the way the whole thing was done in the first place. So having this DNA data, and one thing which sort of makes me sort of skeptical about those who say it's all impossible because this DNA can't be real, is that something like the reanalysis of the Tutankhamun parentage data does actually produce something which seems to work. If it was complete moonshine, you'd only expect it to work in one direction. It actually works for other ways of doing it. But so hence the reason why whenever I write about this now, and it's in my new Nefertiti book as well, is that I have put a big sort of health warning that some of this stuff in here is based on the DNA results. However, you've got to be aware that it's possibly not real at all. And also, what I've tried to say is that my reconstructions of genealogy, which although they are consistent with the DNA, they don't rely on it. So nowhere am I saying that that a relationship is so and so purely because of DNA. I'm saying it because the DNA supports some other data which leads me down this particular route.
That's good. It'd be useful if somebody could sort of redo the data analysis of that study and publish it as a new article, but perhaps that's a pipe dream.
Yeah, well, there have been little bits and pieces of it, I think, in the some of the follow-up publications in the actual original journal, where various genetics people have sort of pushed in on certain things. But the problem is it's also very political as well, which doesn't help.
So just to clarify, because I didn't actually ask this earlier, is based on your reading of the evidence, who are the most likely candidates to be the parents of Tutankhamun?
I'm reasonably happy that his parents were Akhenaten and Nefertiti, who were first cousins and were the outcome of at least three, if not more than 3 generations of first cousin marriage.
So would that make Nefertiti potentially the daughter of
I would. For the genetics to work, if they're real, she would have been the daughter of I and a sister of Amenhotep III.
Okay. Yeah, it's confusing.
Well, it's the one way to say, assuming the genetics are real, that's one way of making it work. And so the question about sort of I think most people, I know there are people who would argue that his father was Menkaure, but the vast majority of people would say it's Akhenaten. But there is but everybody has always seemed to try and avoid saying can be Nefertiti. And now with various people say, his mother was definitely Kia. Well, actually, if you think about what the evidence people use for his mother not being Nefertiti, it's you have all these depictions of her and her daughters, but no sign of a son. But then if you turn it on its head, if you look at all the depictions we have of Kia, they have a daughter with her, but no son. So if you're saying that if you're not shown with your son, you haven't got one, well, you've run out of candidates for his mother altogether, because that's both of the wives of Akhenaten gone. And the key thing also, which is that up until the time of Akhenaten, royal sons are never shown on monuments. Prior to that, the only ones you get are ones who are being shown because they've got a day job, because they're a high priest or something, or they're being shown in the tomb of one of their tutors. It's only in the Ramesside period that the royal sons turn up because they're purely the royal sons. And interestingly, the notorious couple of blocks from Ashmonaim, which name Tutankhaten as a king's son, may actually come from the first ever representation of a king's son on a temple wall by virtue of being a king's son. So, if that's the very first, it's pretty late on in the reign by the looks of things as well. So people were asking to see Tutankhaten with Nefertiti and Akhenaten early in the reign. They're asking something which could not have existed, because nobody had ever done that before. If you look at the Temple of Soleb, you see reliefs of Amenhotep III, Ti, and his daughters. You don't see any sons. Yet nobody would ever question that he had sons of Thutmose and Akhenaten. So I think there's a lot of special pleading. For some reason, some people have never wanted to see Nefertiti as Tutankhamun's mother, and I've never quite understood what that is, because she's the most obvious candidate. And say, if you look back at the decorum, if you want to call it that, of official monuments, you never ever see somebody there purely because they're a king's son of his body. It's there because a king's son and also high priest of Ptah or high priest of something else. That's the only time you find it previously.
Okay, thank you. You've published on the long history of Egyptian royal tomb building. If we were to compare the royal tombs of, say, the 18th dynasty with the Middle and Old Kingdoms that preceded it, do you see any noteworthy similarities and parallels in the design and decoration?
I think the key point is that any Egyptian tomb ideally has two distinct elements. There is the offering place, the interface between this world and the next, and the actual burial place. And all of them actually have that. In fact, what you're seeing when you follow the development of Egyptian tombs from the earliest times down to at least the late period, anyway, when it starts to break down somewhat, is you have this clear division of the two parts. And it's quite the big question when you look at the overall history is whether those two parts are in the same place, whether they're separated, what exact form those two things do. But ultimately, it all still filters down to that basic dichotomy, and all the variations of what you do within that dichotomy.
Okay. And coming back to the 18th dynasty and specifically the Amarna period, which you've published on, of course, in what ways does the Amarna royal tomb of Akhenaten develop on the principles of the 18th dynasty before him?
Right, there's a couple of issues with Akhenaten's tomb. First of all, is we have no evidence of what the offering chapel arrangements would have been. Was there a memorial temple? Would Akhenaten's posthumous cult be practiced in one of the Aten temples? So that's one case we just have no idea about. When we look at the tomb itself, it differs very significantly from anything before or after it. It's clearly some rethinking going on here. At one level, as far as the king himself is concerned, of course, the decoration has nothing to do with decoration before or after. It's simply more of this kind of almost sort of identikit kind of Amarna things of the sun being worshipped by king, queen, daughters, and so on. Although the one funerary thing which you do find is that there is a concept of the king and queen daughters mourning an image of the deceased, and also this deceased also lying on a bier as well. So that's something which is not sort of found in any kind of royal tomb before or since, and is clearly something to do with the whole Amarna concept of what you do with the dead, which we still don't properly understand simply through the lack of material surviving. So the decoration is completely new thing. The other thing, though, is that the tomb is designed as a family catacomb. It's not designed purely for the king, with the possibility of a prematurely deceased wife or daughter or son being sort of put away in one of the side rooms. So, in fact, originally, when you look at the tomb, there's scarring on some of the walls showing where there would have been doorways. So had the thing actually been carried through, as far as one can see how the architect would have wanted it, there could have been something like half a dozen separate complexes opening off that main gallery, which is something you've never find before or after in a royal tomb. The only sort of precursor to this is that Amenhotep III had actually extended what had originally been two of the storerooms in his tomb into what clearly were intended to be burial chambers, presumably for tea, possibly for Sitamun. So the idea of having some kind of architectural provision for a member of the royal family to be buried with you is something brand new with Amenhotep III. We know that some of the earlier kings had improvised burials of prematurely deceased relatives, but no architectural vision. The first time we find that is Amenhotep III. Akhenaten runs with that on a larger scale, but then after that, nobody does it again. The next time we find members of the royal family buried with the king is at Tanis.
Interesting. Such a sudden break.
I think it's part. I think the whole thing is part of Akhenaten's almost year zero approach to things. Everything's up for grabs.
Sort of a complete reset on everything.
I think I've always, as I say, I've often said I think the idea of the art style, a lot of that is to emphasise that it's a year zero kind of approach. It's an in your face, so different in its inner feel from conventional Egyptian art that you have to think that it was something intended to really sort of put two fingers up to whatever had gone before. You know, I've always sort of likened it to punk rock, which was something I very much grew up with, where again everything about, although actually punk rock was just simply speeded up ordinary rock music. However, the imagery and the way it was presented was intended to mark that year zero approach. And I think Akhenaten was doing exactly the same thing. Had he been around in 1977, he'd have been and really understood understood that whole nihilistic, say we're going back to basics, we're going to start again kind of approach.
Interesting. That's quite a take on him. I like that. That's good. So you mentioned the design. The design shift sort of was rejected and not revived again until Tanis, although obviously the Tanite kings probably weren't doing anything consciously with that. But after Akhenaten's death, and after they abandon Amarna, how does the architectural and decorative scheme of the royal tombs change in the late 18th and early 19th dynasties? How does it change with comparison to what Akhenaten did, but also to what came before him in the 18th dynasty?
As far as prototypes are concerned, they jump back to Amenhotep III and earlier as the basic prototype. There's nothing about the post-Amarna royal tombs which really recalls Akhenaten's tomb at all. Rather what you get, and you can really only start tracing this with Horemheb, because I's tomb is certainly not the final plan. It's been sort of brought to a premature conclusion. What Horemheb's architect does is he straightens the whole thing out. So therefore, rather than the characteristic bend or bends earlier on, the whole thing just goes straight down into the rock, just with a slight jig in the middle of it. So architecturally, they've just really sort of tidied up the 18th dynasty type, which had become standard from Amenhotep II's reign onwards. What the big difference comes is in the decoration, and it works at two levels. First of all, they start, and as we move through the 19th and 20th dynasties, the number of them increases. They move from simply having this one basic decorative motif, which is the Book of Amduat. Instead, they move to, first of all, introducing the Book of Gates, and then as you move through the dynasty, the 19th and 20th dynasty, more and more of these underworld books are brought into play. So that's part of it. It becomes a much richer, more varied thing. The other big thing is that they switch under Horemheb from painted decoration, back in Amenhotep III and earlier day, to carved decoration. And that has some quite major impacts on various aspects of the tomb. First of all, for the building of the thing, well, you need a completely new skill set at Deir el-Medina to do this. Previously, you're just talking about people who cut tombs, plaster it, and then it looks like the decoration was actually then done by scribes just drawing on the wall effectively. And it's been argued that the sort of the stick figure kind of stuff was actually done after the funeral had taken place as part of the energization of the tomb. So instead of the basic job of the Deir el-Medina mob is basically to have a nicely plastered, nicely cut tomb, suddenly you need people who are going to then carve the walls. So therefore you need a whole new skill set coming into Deir el-Medina, and actually there is textual material which suggests under Horemheb new people were brought in over and above the previous families, and presumably these are the people who are actually people who carve wall reliefs.
Hmm.
This also has an effect, though. It means you can no longer have this idea that you can decorate the tomb as part of its energization after burial had taken place. There's just no way you can do that because you're generating chips of stone. It takes months. You can't do what had been done previously. So therefore, the idea of how you go about tomb building, what presumably forms part of the funerary ceremonies, all change as a result of this technological, what appears on the face of it, but technological change of of tombs now being carved in relief.
Okay, so when Horemheb's tomb was opened, it was famously full of chips of rubble and debris. Was that likely a consequence of the decoration, or was that a result of the sort of post-burial decorative process?
No, I think what it was simply the tomb wasn't finished. But probably because they were doing this from, and also we don't know what stage in his reign Horeb decides he wants to carve tomb. It may have been that they started off chugging along quite happily for a decade, assuming he was going to have it painted, and then suddenly says, "No, I want it carved." At which point it's all hands to the pumps. And it could well be that because the decoration is unfinished, this is all being done in the last couple of years of the reign because nobody thought about it. Because if you then look only a decade or so further on, Seti I manages to completely carve a tomb and paint it in 10 years, or less than 10 years. So it's either that the learning curve was such that they screwed up in Horemheb's case, or I think probably more likely is that the decision to actually switch from paint to carving was done a bit late in the day, and hence when he died, the tomb was only partly carved, and they'd still got loads of the chips still lying around, and they just took the view, let's just bury him, and we're not gonna spend huge amounts of time clearing all this stuff out. That's certainly my reading of what's going on in Horemheb's case.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of the sort of historical questions, and now it's three questions about your work as an Egyptologist and your career in life. Looking back on your time in Egyptology, you've obviously seen many developments in how historians and scientists and archaeologists approach the field. What are some of the more noteworthy changes in how the field practices and pursues its information today?
I think one of the things is the emergence of remote sensing as far as field work is concerned. There was something of a revolution in the early 20th century when aerial photography started being used for archaeology, but it was the availability of ground-penetrating radar, resistivity, and all those other things, which I think has revolutionised what one can do. First of all, that works on sort of two levels. One, it means that you've got the ability to probe a site quite well before you decide to even lift a single trowel, which is, given shortage of money, is rather an important thing. But it also means you can delve underground and see things even digging wouldn't probably do because of water tables and stuff like that. And also you can do it much, much faster as well. And I think one of the most stunning outcomes was the work of Angus Graham and his team around Karnak, which showed how the landscape around Karnak changed over time, and how parts of the architecture of Karnak can be explained by the way that the landscape has changed. That we now know from his work, which was purely done by little boxes of tricks sitting on the ground. There was and a bit of coring, nothing more than that. That Karnak started off as an island in the river, that which was then swallowed up by the bank, and then gradually the river retreated westwards, and that explains, for example, why the inner pylons of the Karnak temple are all squished together the way they are. There's only sort of a few yards between them. It's because there was a river in the way. They couldn't actually, if you wanted to stick another pylon in front of the temple, you couldn't do it. It was only possibly after, whether this was purely natural or with a bit of help from sort of land reclamation, that things moved back significantly between Amenhotep III and Horemheb, allowing what's now the hypostyle hall to be built. So in some ways, I think that is almost the poster child for one of what field work changes have been. Beyond sort of the way that sort of field work, there's the very fact that funding continues to be, it's got worse and worse and worse as far as these things are concerned. So the nature of what you can, the sort of large scale field work, which I saw perhaps when I was a student, is much less easy to be able to do nowadays. The other sort of areas of things have moved on, I think, is a much greater degree of, at least amongst some anyway, of sort of self-consciousness about the nature of the subject, its limitations, and so on. I've done a lot of work over the last few years on the history of Egyptology, and I think that's become one thing, which is the very fact that now more people are interested in the history of the subject, where we've come from and where we're going to, I think is quite powerful in making us more introspective and understanding what our limitations actually are. And also, I think that there is a problem in the writing of Egyptian history, in the sense I'm not sure that all jobbing Egyptologists, if you want to call them that, necessarily fully perceive the way that history is actually, writing history is something requiring specific skills. And some, I think there are people who've tried sort of to produce historical stuff perhaps shouldn't have done. On the upside of that, there is now a Journal of Egyptian History, which there wasn't a long time ago. But the majority of people who are involved in Egyptology are sort of doing culture, language, archaeology kind of things. There are very few positions in universities which are specifically to do with Egyptian history. You almost count them on figure of one hand.
So, building on from that, are there any sort of methodologies or ideas and philosophies that you would like to see Egyptologists use more in their work?
I think they've just really got, I think they need, because they are, sometimes the individual is covering a whole range of stuff, which sort of in other areas of study would be different people, is to further develop that kind of self-consciousness about what you're doing, what the limitations of what you're doing are. I wouldn't say there are any particular techniques I would say people need to adopt. When people try and do that, they end up with egg on their faces. It's sort of some examples a few decades ago where people were certainly were latching on to now obsolete anthropological ideas, and then trying to make a name by espousing those. And in fact, all ended up looking rather silly, because the anthropologist was saying, well, that's what we were thinking of 10 years ago. We don't think that anymore. I think it's just really safe. It's be conscious of what there is out there in the various sub-bits of the sub-discipline, and make sure you don't jump on too many bandwagons. It's always a temptation to make your name by adopting some particular anthropological or linguistic theory, but make sure you understand it first before you try and sort of fold it into Egyptology.
Fair enough. So this is a question that I ask of everybody that I interview. Supposing you had the opportunity to answer one question or issue definitively from Egyptian history or culture or society, if you could know one fact or piece of material with absolute certainty, what would you choose to know?
I think I would want to know what year Thutmose III came to the throne, because if you did that, you're able to build the rest of the chronology almost to the New Kingdom and onwards. If you knew for certain what year that was, that would make life so much easier. The other option would actually be what was the date of the unification of Egypt, would be the other one. But the historian in me, I'm always frustrated by the being able, not really knowing quite when things happened. to be able to at least have one date which I knew prior to 669, which otherwise I think is the sort of the other one we've got, or 690, should I say. It would be rather good. So I was one of the key dates of pre Taharqa history. So 690 is currently our earliest real date. Everything else is guesstimate at best. So I'd love to know one of those sort of crucial accession dates for real.
It shouldn't surprise me that was your answer, actually. Based on your publications, I just finished writing 2 or 3 scripts dealing with the rebellions in Amurru and their context within the Great Syrian Wars of Shibboleth. And that whole thing was a nightmare to put into any kind of narrative.
Because everything is relative to it. Yeah. Everything's relative to everything else. That's the trouble with it. So at least having one fixed point in this quagmire would be useful. So you're not going round and round in circles, because to know when something specifically happened. Yeah.
I compare it to a jigsaw where you're missing all of the edge pieces, so you still don't know whether you're in the middle of the picture or the edge or.
Just so, yeah, absolutely, yes. Which is one thing which makes it fun, though, in the sense you can actually change history because we have got virtually no fixed points. You can actually play tunes to a degree which you couldn't do if you were a medieval historian of Europe or something like that. You can actually decide whether somebody even exists or not, or change their sex or whatever, just by one new discovery. So that's one thing I quite like. It's one of the reasons why I've done a lot of work on the Third Intermediate period, because it's a place where it's such apparently a mess, but you can actually get really into it, so make a difference.
That's a fair point. So that brings me to the end of my questions. We've gone slightly over time, but I hope I didn't keep you too late.
No, that's fine.
Great. So, Professor Dodson, many thanks for your time and for speaking with us in the middle of the evening for you. I hope you've enjoyed yourself, and I hope you would consider visiting the podcast again when we come to later rulers that you have researched.
Very happy to do that. Yes.
Excellent. When do you have any inclination on when your new works on Nefertiti and so forth are likely to appear?
Nefertiti should be out in the autumn, so October, November, I think.
Oh, fantastic!
Because it's going to press on the 20th of May. So on the basis of when Ramesses III came out, it should be sort of October, November, I would guess. I'm sure once it actually goes to press, I'll probably get a proper thing. I think, although of course at the moment with all the all the various uncertainties, I suspect that it's been printed in China. It's all, but generally it should be out for Christmas anyway.
And your next book, Tutankhamun, was it?
Well, the next one is the First Pharaohs, and then there's a Tutankhamun one in the same series, which is due to be an unashamed cash-in on the on the centenary. So that should be out in November 2022.
Jolly good.
So basically, I'm working on a volume of this series each year now.
Okay.
Which was never originally intended. It was just that Seti the First was produced. Everybody seemed to like the way it hung together. I thought it was quite a nice way of doing a fair, a slightly unusual way of doing it. So they've got after that there is the Nubian pharaohs, and then Thutmose the Third and Hatshepsut. I'm currently signed up to do.
Great.
Okay, keep me busy for the next few years anyway.
Yes, we'll have to have you back to talk about them at some point. So yes, thank you very much for joining us.
Okay, and look forward to seeing it going live.
My special thanks to Professor Dodson for joining me for that wonderful conversation. There is a little bit extra from the discussion, which I will release in a later episode. It has to do with the death of Akhenaten and what happened immediately after he passed. That information will come in a future episode when we reach the proper moment. For now, thank you to Professor Dodson and to Pen and Sword Publishing for organising the conversation. That's all from me. I'll be back soon. See you on the next episode.